Let me start with an interesting quotation. This is from Nobel laureate Francis Crick. You may recognize that name, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA and a neuroscientist himself. Here's what he had to say. The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. Hi, this is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. So what's Crick getting at here? Well, this is a materialistic view of humans. In other words, materialism says the material universe is all there is. There's no soul. There's no God. There's nothing outside of matter, space, time, and energy. And so if there is no God and nothing supernatural, there's nothing immortal about us. We have no soul. And in fact, the things we think are true about us as far as our immortality, he says, it's just astonishing. We're just a bunch of nerve cells, right? So we don't have a mind. We do not have a mind. All we have is a brain. We're nothing but a pack of neurons. Well, this last year, 2025, a new book came out, and I want to share that with you today and in future podcasts. It's called The Immortal Mind. Two authors, Michael Egnor, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, it's Egnor, and Denise O'Leary. And it's subtitled A Neurosurgeon's Case for the Existence of the Soul. And Egnor is professor of neurosurgery and pediatrics and neurosurgery residency director at the Renaissance School of Medicine in Stony Brook, New York. Denise O'Leary is an author of several books on the topic of science. She has a book out called The Spiritual Brain. So here's a book that's challenging this idea that we're just a machine. Let me share a couple of thoughts of what people have said. Sean McDowell, you recognize that name, author and editor of more than 20 books. He says, this book blew me away. And by the way, can I stop right there and just say amen? As I read it, I shared many of the stories with my wife. Yeah, I did that too. Why? While I have studied the philosophy of the mind since graduate school, Dr. Egnor makes some fresh insights because of his training and experience as a neurosurgeon. If you want to know if there's good evidence for the existence of the soul, The Immortal Mind is a must-read. Yeah, and I agree with that. So let's get into this book. I'm going to go kind of in the middle of it because I'm just picking out things I think are really interesting. I'm sure you've heard of near-death experiences, people that have had their heart stopped and no brainwave activity because they're in a deep coma or they had the blood drained to do some kind of operation, have seen things, have reported things, have seen light, end of a tunnel, and for whatever reason, they're told you got to go back, and they come back. They don't want to come back, but they come back, and they're far more peaceful and happy with their life. They're far less suicidal. Just some good things have come about. Well, a lot of theists have said, well, there you go. There's at least proof that something is going on beyond death, beyond the death of the brain, beyond the death of the heart. There's something that's continuing. Now, it's not an argument necessarily for the Christian heaven or existence of God, but it seems like something, from their perspective, something is lasting beyond the body. Well, of course, materialists are going to say, oh, no. And they're going to argue that there actually is nothing to it. There are some ways to understand it that get rid of the idea of an immortal soul. So, let me just share, as we get into this, I was just looking at a quote here by Carl Sagan. You recognize that name, the astronomer? He used to be on television a lot. He'd say billions and billions. Anyway, he said, I would love to believe that when I die, I will live again, that some thinking, feeling, remembering part of me will continue. But as much as I want to believe that, and despite the ancient and worldwide cultural traditions that assert an afterlife, I know of nothing to suggest it's more than wishful thinking. So he and a bunch of others have tried to explain away near-death experiences. So the author, Egnor, is taking a whole chapter and let the skeptics have their say, but pointing out, yeah, but each one of their ways of trying to explain it away these ways don't work. So here's Sagan's idea. So here's one idea. These NDEs, as they're called, near-death experiences, they're just memories of our own births. That was Sagan. The idea of traveling down a tunnel is a birth memory, right? Coming into this world. His hypothesis ignores the fact that, wait a minute, a typical NDE experience is one of peace and joy. It's not like a baby coming into the delivery room. It says when a baby exits the womb, the top of the head comes first, so the baby is looking backwards and won't see anything resembling a tunnel. And the light that's described by these near-death experiences is described as something warm and loving. Well, that's not a delivery room. It's painfully bright, and it's a lot colder than the mother's womb. This is anyone who's observed a typical birth knows it's a time of great distress for the baby. It's not peaceful. It's not reassuring. Then, of course, you've got some babies that are born by cesarean section, right? So that's interesting as well. No difference was found between the two groups, so birth memories could not have been the cause of the NDEs. So it's implausible. Newborns have pretty limited ability to perceive what's going on or to form memories. So let's toss that one. I don't think that one works at all. Here's a second one. It may be just wishful thinking, right? So Rational Wiki Encyclopedia says wishful thinking may generate experiences, of what a subject wants to believe. Well, the problem is you've got clinical brain death in NDEs, many of them, and that precludes any mental activity, include wish fulfillment. How can you wish for something if you've got a brain that's dead? Okay, so NDEs, let me move on here because there's a lot of information. A radiation oncologist and near-death researcher, Jeffrey Long, says this: NDE experiencers provide accurate accounts of events that they themselves did not expect to occur. It's not wishful thinking. It's not illusory memories, what they were expecting to have happen if they got close to death. These things were profound and life-changing. It's not wishful thinking. It actually changed their lives. How about this one? Does the trauma of impending death cause people to imagine near-death experiences? Maybe they call it depersonalization. Psychiatrists wonder if a sense of unreality or detachment from the body could produce NDEs. Yeah, but the NDE experience, as Dr. Egnor points out, is profoundly different from depersonalization. So what's that? Depersonalization is experienced in the body, and it has a lot of anxiety and dysphoria. But these NDEs are out of body, and they're generally very pleasant experiences. Okay, so that doesn't seem to work very well. Here's another possibility. Could it be just imagination? Just imagination, maybe educated guesses. People have watched medical TV shows. Is that likely? Well, somebody did a study, found that NDE experiencers who had suffered cardiac arrest generally showed more knowledge of what had happened in the emergency room in which they'd been treated when they were clinically dead than patients who had a cardiac arrest but didn't have a near-death experience. So how could it be an imagination? They actually noticed things. How is that possible? Hard to know. Even though it's total cessation of blood supply to the brain. All right, what about some critics say, well, wait a minute. Maybe the NDEs are a consequence of ordinary perception while the dying patient is still semi-conscious. In other words, they're vaguely aware that things are going on around them. They may look dead or appear to be out of it, but they are hearing things. Well, one problem with that explanation, the doctor says, is that patients who are semi-conscious due to anesthesia report hearing medical activity going around them but not seeing it. But NDE experiences both see and hear. So there's one, let's see, here's an account of a patient who had experienced both perception during a medical emergency and perception during an NDE, and he reported the difference. Here's what the patient said: I didn't see nothing, I just heard. talking about the non-NDE. I didn't see nothing. I just heard. This other time, he's talking about the NDE with the cardiac arrest. I was looking down from the ceiling, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Well, a semi-conscious perception also does not account for instances of knowledge of conditions in the operating room that would have been unavailable to ordinary perception. Right? So some of them can go up high and look down. Some people are actually outside the room. How does that happen? If you're semi-conscious, you can't do that. Then somebody else says, well, okay. He says here, when all else fails, try Darwinian evolution. So some people have suggested NDEs are a part of human evolvement that animals possess. It's called thanatosis. Opossums, for example, are famous for this. They can play dead to discourage predators, and they do look dead. Trouble is, that explanation doesn't really account for very much. Animals who have metabolisms that can shut down as a defense mechanism can't help us understand much about the spiritual nature of human NDEs. So he throws that one out the window. Here's another possibility. Maybe it's hallucinations, right? Maybe the process of nearly dying led to hallucinations. Well, hallucinations are fragmented and they're disturbing and they're subrational. You should not expect those generated by the death process to be any different, but they are. Near-death experiences are very different. Here's a typical account from an NDE person. I went into a dark place with nothing around me, but I wasn't scared. It was really peaceful there. I then began to see my whole life unfolding before me like a film projected on a screen from babyhood to adult life. It was so real. I was looking at myself, but better than a 3D movie, as I was also capable of sensing the feelings of the persons I had interacted with through the years. I could feel the good and bad emotions I made them go through. That doesn't sound like a hallucination or derangement. And a hallucination would not also account for the way that NDE people know what's going on around them when they're clinically dead. Okay, so it says, in both child and adult near-death experiences, the relatives they encounter are almost always dead ones, not living ones. Why would hallucinations select deceased people? That seems odd. It seems like a dream or hallucination, you'd conjure up a living person. Well, here's another possibility. What about this? Could near-death experiences really be temporal lobe seizures? But that's not likely. Those kinds of seizures have a very well-characterized pattern that they deal with on a regular basis. They can include fear, joy, déjà vu, strange odors, as roller coaster sensation, or failure to recognize familiar people. That's not what NDE experiences report. Plus it says, look, I like this, the doctor says, it can't be emphasized enough that near-death experiences can happen when there's no circulation of blood to the brain. Okay, there's nothing that ties into just a lobe seizure. Well, what about this? There's something called hypoxia. That's brain oxygen shortage. Maybe that produces near-death experiences. Doctor says, well, hypoxia produces intense agitation, fear, confusion, lethargy, irritability, inability to concentrate. That's not what you get with NDEs. They give out a feeling of peace and clarity. I think that's good to know. It says, by the way, the oxygen levels of dying patients who have near-death experiences have turned out to be higher than those of patients who don't have them. So NDEs are not really about shortage of oxygen to the brain. Well, here comes the next one, right? So it's attempt after attempt to get away from the idea that there might be a mind at work here. So here's another materialist idea. High levels maybe of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. That's called hypercarbia. Maybe that explains it. He says that faces a big problem. Blood carbon dioxide levels can have no effect on brain function if the brain is clinically dead. Okay, so that seems to toss that one. Another one, could NDEs be created by chemicals produced naturally in the brain? So some skeptics say there are neurochemicals like endorphins that are generated by the dying brain, or maybe drugs that are administered to the people during a resuscitation attempt. But they said the problem is it's easy to distinguish between the effects of NDEs and those of chemicals. So I said, if you give somebody a drug or the brain chemical kicks in, they're usually varied and inconsistent and idiosyncratic mental states, bizarre visual perceptions, cobwebs, honeycombs, lattices. It's not, you don't get a clear vision that's typical of NDEs. One person, Bruce Grayson, looked into suggestions that administering drugs to the patient was causing an NDE. He found the opposite of what skeptics might expect. Quote, the more drugs people are given as they approach death, the less likely they are to report near-death experiences. So drugs and lack of oxygen are not causing NDEs. They may, in fact, repress having an NDE. All right, so that may not be true either. Somebody else has Susan Blackmore. She's a researcher. She's trying another explanation. Maybe NDEs are just what happens to a dying brain. It's just retinal disturbances. So, in other words, retinal cells in the eye are caught up in the process of dying, and maybe they image a tunnel. And maybe the peripheral vision blacks out before the central vision. He says, perhaps. But the tunnels described in near-death experiences are clearly visible. They're highly detailed. Now, if you got retinal cells dying, you wouldn't expect that kind of clarity. And also, many near-death experiences don't involve a tunnel. Well, she comes up with something she calls the dying brain hypothesis. So it's just a variety of physiological processes, she says, during the death. The brain builds up an image of reality to compensate for disintegration. He says, well, the difficulty with this theory is the obvious one. A brain disintegrating in the process of dying is hardly able to build any image of reality at all, let alone what we get with NDEs that can be so clear and compelling and often beautiful. He says the bottom line is the dying brain is disorganized and failing, but near-death experiences are highly organized and peaceful. That seems to throw that out. So as he wraps up the section here that he's been talking about, he says, in general, the weaknesses of the materialist explanations. So in Psychology Today, a man named Steve Taylor said this, NDEs have never been satisfactorily explained in neurobiological terms. All of these theories have been found to be problematic. Yeah, so he's saying that these other explanations try to account for a specific selected aspect of the near-death experience. They fail to account for the complete experience. And it says the way they account for that narrow aspect of NDEs that they focus on always conflicts with all the other evidence. He says that's why no skeptical explanation provides a credible account of NDEs. So he wraps up the chapter by saying many studies point very strongly to the reality of near-death experiences. And as this chapter has tried to do, he's showing that efforts to try to explain them away don't work. They've been documented in cultures throughout the world for thousands of years. Says the evidence for them is massive. It's significant, he says, that religious beliefs and previous knowledge don't necessarily predispose a person to a near-death experience. They happen across cultures, and they're often life-changing. And they seem to be an objective experience. Jeffrey Long told an interview in 2023, I've read brain research and considered every possible explanation for NDEs. The bottom line is that none of them hold water. There isn't even a remotely plausible physical explanation for this phenomenon. So, what do the near-death experiences tell us, according to Egnor? Well, verified NDEs confirm there is some kind of immaterial aspect, you could call it a mind or soul, that survives the death of the brain. They just have so many stories that they've checked up on. And so all the materialist attempts to explain them away have implausible scenarios. And he says it's just a strong materialist ideological bias among some scientists that cause them to cling stubbornly to this idea. So I hope you found that interesting. That's just one chapter. There's some really good points in here that I want to bring up in future podcasts. But I thought that would be interesting to you because we're hearing a lot about NDEs, and we'll hear even more in the future. Well, thanks for being part of this today, and hope things are going well for you.